Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. In this presentation I'd like to raise an obviously controversial subject, but what we're looking at is young Hitler, say before 1926, 1927, sort of around there, or before 1929 I guess. And what we're looking for is evidence of anti-Semitism. Now the definition of anti-Semitism is in this instance at least, the dislike or even hatred or disdain for Jewish people purely because they're Jewish, not because of their behaviour, not because of what they've done, not what they do, not what they're involved, but purely because they're Jewish and no other reason. That's anti-Semitism at its clearest definition, I would argue. Although please put your comments down below if you think otherwise. So we're looking now the narrative woven about Hitler, and we're not talking about we're talking about what ended up as being a world war with mass murder and all sorts of things going on. Didn't work out well for the Jews, we know that. So we know the end game here. So what we're looking at is we're going back to the early days of Hitler and saying, well, let's have a look at the evidence that he was anti-Semitic, purely because people were Jewish and no other reason. And can we find that? And if we can find that, excuse me, how many examples or instances or pieces of evidence can we put together to put that theory forward? Or was there a lack of anti-Semitism? Or was there criticism of the behaviour of certain Jews? Because that's not anti-Semitism. So let's separate the two and see how we go. Now, the narrative that's woven about, and it's not hard to, the guy did plenty of bad things, so it's not hard to put together a negative narrative. But the narrative put together is that he was pretty much waving a swastika as soon as he came out of the womb. And, obviously he was evil, obviously this, and let's go back in time and kill baby Hitler and so on and so forth. I would argue that's quite absurd, and I would argue the evidence doesn't really support that. And when you peel back the propaganda and the layers of the narrative, which few people are prepared to question, Hitler is the go-to. So if you want to say someone, and you notice this with college kids, they'll start off by calling someone a fascist. You're a fascist. And if that doesn't get traction, they'll go, oh, you're a Nazi. And if that doesn't get traction, they'll come out with the ultimate. They'll come out with the heavy gun and say, you're Hitler. This is the level of sort of analysis that's going on, certainly in the articles that you see. Now, I'll start. Young Hitler was born in 1889 in Austria, quite close to the German border. Moved to Germany. The family was 1913, or moved to Germany permanently rather in 1913. But they moved actually to Bavaria. This is a province of southern Germany when Hitler was still an infant. Turns out he had quite a good singing voice and sang in choirs, and he enjoyed operas and so on. His father died when Hitler was 14. They apparently didn't get on too well. The father wanted Hitler to take like an apprenticeship as a government, like a public service employee in Austria, in customs and as a customs officer effectively, or trainee customs officer. Hitler didn't want to do that. He wanted to become an artist, and if you look at some of his paintings and watercolours, they were pretty decent, I guess. I'm no artist myself, so he wanted to go to study art in Vienna. They went back from Bavaria to Austria by this time. Goes to study, or wants to study art in Vienna. He's partly funded by like an orphan's pension that the Austro-Hungarian government were offering at the time. I think it was 1907, around then. But given that he hadn't graduated from senior high school, some of the better places that he wanted to get into wouldn't take him. So now we need to understand the times here. We'll pick 1907, I guess, as a reference point. The Russian Empire. No, let me go back further here. There'd been a series of I suppose you could call them revolutions in Europe, 1830, 1848, and they were convulsions that went across, in France, Prussia, and the other German states, and even getting into the the Russian Empire. And remember, Poland, or most of Poland anyway, including Warsaw, was part of the Russian Empire. And a lot of Jews were in what would later become Poland, as in getting on for millions. Now, the Russian secret police, this is the Tsarist regime, this is pre-Bolshevik, they clearly and accurately identified the majority of the agitators and stirrers and exponents of communist revolution and socialism were Jewish. And that's not a fact in dispute, and nor is it anti-Semitic. They just noticed that, hey, 8 out of every 10 agitators are Jewish, and given that Jews make up a small percentage of the total population, how come they're so incredibly overrepresented among communist agitators and stirrers and activists and so on? So the Russian government at the time decided to, we're talking, say, from 1860s onwards, I guess, around that time, decided to start expelling any Jews that showed signs of political activism, I suppose you'd call it. A lot of them moved around Europe or went to the United States. This particularly picked up speed in the 1880s and 1890s. And the Russian government was feeling rather vulnerable after the defeat from the Japanese in 1895, and that made them a little bit jumpier still, and they were evicting more. A lot of Russian Jews went to the United States and elsewhere around Europe during this time. Plenty of them going to Vienna. And we need to sort of put Vienna in perspective here. The Bolshevik Revolution, Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky and so on, these were Stalin later on became a bigger player, but certainly Lenin and Trotsky and Bukharin and those sort of guys in the earlier days. And you have to understand that they were all over Vienna in Austria at the time. They were meeting in some of the most fashionable coffee shops of Vienna. In downtown Vienna, like Lenin and Trotsky are literally sitting in a coffee shop plotting revolutionary behaviour, being watched, of course, by the local secret police. So there was this large movement of Jewish activists, particularly Jewish activists, going across Europe, as I say, in Austria as much, if not more so, than other places. The German government or German regional and provincial government, particularly Prussia, was watching closely, and they were getting kicked out and moved along out of there. So Austria is one of the few places that was allowing these people in, allowing them to stay. And again, you've got the key players in the Bolshevik Revolution sitting in Viennese coffee shops, plotting revolution. So this idea that Hitler sort of had an anti-Semitic view, or other people around. I mean, it was hardly Hitler alone. It was a little bit different. There were a lot of Jewish communist socialist activists, revolutionaries, agitators, stirrers, pamphleteers and so on around Austria at the time, and many Austrians, not just Hitler, but many Austrians didn't like that. They thought it was not so good. So the environment at the time was a lot of Jewish socialist communist activists around, causing disruptions, and it was viewed unfavourably by people, as you would expect. That's like not an interesting thing. It's not a unique or unusual thing, rather. So a lot of these there was a lot of negative views about Jewish communists and activists. Now, this is separate from anti-Semitism. You may look at it and say, well, out of every 100 Marxist agitators, and 95 of them are Jewish, and you make that connection. But that's not anti-Semitism. That's something about the behaviour. Why are these people so involved and so overrepresented in this sort of thing? And we need to go back to the growing Zionist attitudes in the Jewish diaspora, not simply in just Austria but across Europe and elsewhere, and active Zionist views about creating a Jewish homeland in the Middle East or in the Levant, and there were already in place activities to achieve that, which it later did over the next 20 or so years, creating the State of Israel. Now, the general Jewish sort of diaspora, that I'm talking in general terms now, was that socialism and Marxism, communism would create an equal society, and then Jews would be forever protected within that equal society because everybody would be equal. And therefore, you need to channel the kibbutz and the attitude of equality that supposedly would exist in a kibbutz. So the general architecture of thought is already there, if you like, in the Jewish diaspora. And so the idea is that we would support socialism, communism, Marxism because it'll create this equal society. Then never again will we be persecuted. So that was part of the wider thing there. Now, I think that was a crazy idea as is today, but nonetheless, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So Hitler is in the middle of this as a young man. Hitler's in the middle of this, and he's watching and seeing, as many others are, and commenting on. This is presented today as, well, there you go, that's proof that Hitler was a damn fucking anti-Semite from way back and hated Jews. No, that's not right. That's a misrepresentation. Hitler didn't like the influx of these people from outside, the Russian emigres and so on, and didn't like, as long with many, many others, he's highly unique. I mean, millions thought this way, that this socialist, Marxist, revolutionary agitation was not a good thing. It was going to create more problems than it could ever solve, and the solutions were illusory anyway. And the people around Hitler, and Hitler too, thought that. Now, he's still a young man at this point, so he's hardly going to look at it through the lens of somebody who had much life experience. Now, a few years after his father died, his mother died, and Hitler lost the allowances that he previously had, so he went moving from living in homeless shelters, working casual jobs, and selling some of his decent enough paintings. Now, it's hard to find any evidence that Hitler was anti-Semitic. Again, the definition being hating Jews simply because they were Jewish. It's very hard to find any evidence of that at all, and it took 5 years for sort of probate for the estate of his father and mother and his family to be settled. So he got a small sum of money and then decided to move to Germany. Now, the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, it doesn't exist anymore, of course, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, the empire of the Habsburgs, it had 4 sort of major nationalities, or 7 really, I guess, and 10 minor nationalities. So you're talking about 17, in some cases, some people alleging as many as 20 different national languages that needed to be catered for. Now, the Austro-Hungarian government decided to do this by indulging all these nationalities and giving handouts, government jobs, gifting quangos to the area, all sorts of things like that in order to buy loyalty. So inevitably the empire was going downhill, and I think anybody at the time could see that it was really staggering along at that point. The Austro-Hungarian government decided that if they could simply annex in other Slavic type territories like Serbia and those sort of places, that they could fend off the nationalistic feelings. Now, here's another thing to sort of consider at the time, that nationalism was widespread. Nationalism among Slavs and Serbians and Greeks, Germans, French. Nationalism was very widespread. The nationalism was presented as being a byproduct of Nazi thought and anti-Semitism. That's not true. That's a misrepresentation. Again, nationalism, nationalism was everywhere at the time. It was viewed to be have pride in your nation and this sort of stuff. And this is where Hitler got the idea of the Austro-Hungarian Empire wouldn't really last the way it was staggering along, and that the German peoples of Europe, because Austrians were Germans effectively, the Germanic peoples of Europe should be united in one Germanic nation. This was again, you see, fucking Nazi. That's not true. The idea that all French people should be, and all German people, all Serbian people, and all Russian, and so on. This was a widespread view everywhere. Nothing unique to Hitler or Germans at all, and it's a misrepresentation to claim that it was some sort of forerunner of Nazism. It wasn't. And shouldn't be depicted as that. Hitler was living in Munich when World War One broke out. Now, so he's moved to Munich, or southern Germany really, in 1913. And if you listen to his accent, his German-speaking accent, you can't really pick up the Austrian in it so much. You kind of, a little bit maybe, but anyone that lived close to the Austrian, Bavarian, like southern German border would have had that type of accent. So it didn't necessarily sound non-Germanic. And because he'd lived in Bavaria, not only as a child with his folks, but also later on as a young man, he was able to really speak German with what would be passed off as a Bavarian accent at the time. So, and this would be important later on. If he'd been running around talking in a broad sort of Austrian accent, it probably wouldn't have gone over so well. Now, as a result of the Austro-Hungarian experience, Hitler was firmly of the view that multiculturalism just doesn't work. Try as you might, it won't work. So Hitler's in Munich in southern Germany when World War One breaks out. Now, there's allegations he was rejected from the Austrian army because of lack of fitness. I don't know about that, but remember Hitler's later on employed as a message runner on the front lines, so he must have been a very fit, fast-running guy to be able to have a job like that. They didn't employ people that were slow and cumbersome. You had to be, so that would suggest he was very fit. So I don't know about this earlier thing that he lacked the fitness. So anyway, Hitler, when the war breaks out, he signs up with a local kind of volunteer sort of militia unit. And initially the Germans are expecting quite a quick victory in the war. It doesn't happen. So then they start to look for more soldiers and conscripts, and they become less fussy as to who they bring. So the militia units are then brought into the German army proper, and then Hitler sort of came into the German army through that. Now, there's a lot of talk about, given he was still an Austrian citizen at this point, the rules were that if you're an Austrian citizen, because Austria was at war as well, you would be sent back to Austria, and you wouldn't get a gig in the German army. But for some reason, no one seems to really know. It was sort of passed off as some sort of administrative error, and the Germans are not noted for administrative errors. So somehow it got missed that he was Austrian, maybe because he had a Bavarian accent or something. I don't know, but he ended up going into the German army, and for the period of the war, he spent most of it on running around the front lines as a message dispatcher, dispatch runner as they called it. And again, snipers getting shot at, running around the front lines. Because of course, when with all the artillery shells exploding, the telephone wires would get blown out. And while they were spending hours to relay the telephone wires, the messages had to be done manually, and they were done by a dispatch runner. So Hitler was in that. So he must have been a really fit guy, fast-running guy. And he's in his mid-20s at this point. And then he spends in the total period of the war, he spent something like 4 months in hospital, and he got shot, or shrapnel hit him in the leg, and then there was a mustard gas thing where he was blinded for several weeks as a result of the mustard gas. He spent probably a year and a half, a little bit over a year and a half, in the sort of the head office or the regional headquarters of the army group, and he was doing drawings and writing articles for the military newspaper. Though this probably gave him a pretty good grounding in propaganda and how to structure messaging for consumption by the masses. Now, to give you some idea, Hitler's obviously many times presented as a snivelling coward, but he actually won an award for bravery twice. So one of those being the Iron Cross First Class, which is the highest award for bravery offered in the German army. So now Hitler only achieved the level of corporal. So if there was any sort of managerial skill that he possessed, it wasn't noticeable at the time, or certainly not by the people in the army. Now, to be an officer in the army, you pretty much had to be an aristocrat, or vouched for, if you like, by an aristocrat. And Hitler was definitely no aristocrat. So, but nonetheless, he was awarded the highest award, two awards for bravery, and one of them the highest award that the German army offers. So we have to realise that he was a very brave man, and this idea that he was a snivelling coward was never true or never real. And somebody who's achieved that sort of bravery, that level of bravery. Now I don't know whether it was a self-sacrificial type bravery or absolute courage in its totality. It's a little bit harder to tell, but brave nonetheless, and that should be recognised. So. Now, it's interesting too as well that a number of the supervisors Hitler had when he's doing the newspapers and drawing the things happened to be Jewish, and was showing him how to craft propaganda. The irony of that. Now, when the war ended, and Hitler was in hospital when the war ended from the mustard gas thing, blinded by the mustard gas, he stayed on in the army. It's hard to say what he was actually doing, but he was assigned to go into what was called the German Workers' Party. Later on became the National German Workers' Party or Nazi Party. So, but it was claimed that in some speeches he made in 1919, this is in this Workers' Party thing, that people who observed him were impressed by his oratory. He had an ability to put together quite effective speeches, make people listen to him, and so on. Later on, he worked. He moved from the army payroll, if you will, into the payroll on this political party, which was really still quite small, and then again later on changed its name to National Socialist Workers' Party. Now we need to understand the environment as Hitler entered politics proper. We need to understand Germany was going through. At the time, Germany was going through sort of an attempted revolution per week, but by Marxist communist socialist revolutionaries, and and the most well known among them was Karl Liebknecht and the lesbian school teacher Rosa Luxemburg, both Jewish. And again, you find this relationship between Jewish activists, communist, Marxist, socialist activists, and the revolutionaries. You read through the names of the people leading these revolutions, and it was all, not all, but nearly all, Jewish people. Some of these put in as agitators from the recently formed Bolshevik party, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But this idea was, in Marxist thought at the time, Marxist theory at the time, was that the Marxist revolutions would come from the heavily industrialised societies. Russia was an outlier in this because it was still quite an agrarian society when the Bolsheviks seized power, but Germany was one of the most industrialised countries in the world. So this was seen again by the international sort of Marxist groupings as Germany was the most likely candidate, particularly as it was so weakened by defeat in World War One, and the new government was really still finding its feet and still trying to assert itself, if you like, in the country. So in the midst of that confusion, uncertainty and weakness, the communists saw their as they saw it, their chance to take control. So they had, again, revolutions everywhere you look. And so this is the environment that Hitler's in, and anybody's in, any German is in at the time. You see in the papers all the revolutions that are going on, and you see that they're nearly all led by Jewish people. With a heavy representation of homosexuals and lesbians among that group. So when you look at the, again, Germans at the time would look at the stage plays and the very early days of movie theatre, and again you see this promotion of gay, lesbian, Marxism, socialism, Jewish doctors saying that you can change your gender, and all this sort of stuff that's going on, and it's again all Jews at the forefront. So the feeling would have been widespread that hey, this is something that's uniquely Jewish. Now, is that anti-Semitism, or is it a criticism of the behaviour, or is it a concern over, look at the behaviour of these people? The people who are conducting or engaging in this behaviour also happen to be Jewish. So I think it's that. I don't, looking through, I don't see the anti-Semitism here. I see why are these people behaving that way. So if the Jewish diaspora had stopped behaving that way, there would be no such thing as it's packaged up today as the anti-Semitism. Now, when Hitler's making speeches, the people look back today, or again, the narrative is that he had some magical hypnotic effect. It was like magic dust that he just put out over the audience, and they all fell about in paroxysms of delight or something. That's bullshit. Was Hitler an effective speaker? I guess. I've listened to his speeches. You listen to the German. I don't think they're that. What hypnotic effect they had, I don't know. He was the only one talking about the issues. He was the only politician talking about addressing the issues and doing something. We'll fix the problems. These are the problems, we'll fix them. No other politician was doing that. So the idea that he had some magical control, hypnotic effect, that's bullshit, absolute bullshit. And if you read the accounts of people that go along to, or went along to Hitler's speeches, remember in the early days he's going to town halls and he's only talking to 5, 6, 10, 12, 20 people. There's no packed out auditoriums or anything, or packed out sports fields. It's quite the opposite. He's talking to very small groups of people, or anyone who's really prepared to come along and listen. And there was Albert Speer, who was later on Hitler's architect, and later on actually armaments or war minister, war production minister. He and some friends went along to see when Hitler was in the local town or wherever they were, and they'd read the media reports that Hitler was a madman, frothing at the mouth and screaming and turning somersaults and all this sort of stuff. So they went along expecting to have a good laugh at Hitler's expense, and found that it was very boring and bland. That Hitler talked about things like getting people jobs, fixing the roads, making sure everyone had a good education, and making sure that the electricity was turned on. Just bland political stuff. And so this idea of this he had this hypnotic effect. His oratory was somehow firebrand. They pick on probably 3 or 4 speeches that Hitler made in his entire lifetime that were on newsreels, where he finished with a sort of rising crescendo of song. Because in the German, hardly anybody understands it, but it sounds like he's an excitable sort of dude. But the majority of his speeches were very bland, and there was no hypnotic effect or firebrand rhetoric. Far from it. He was talking about dealing with the issues and solving the problems, and that's why people were supporting him. Now, in the early days when Hitler was having meetings, this is like party meetings or even speeches, the Communist Party would find out, the communist goons would find out where these meetings were being held, and they would send a bunch of goons over to either stop people from going in or to try and beat up the Nazi officials and slap them around and so on. The Nazis were very quick to respond to this, and they hired and recruited their own goon squad. Very early days, it was Ernst Röhm who was a big player in the brown shirts and all this sort of stuff. So the Nazis had their own counter goon squad. And so they would have these, the pickaxe handles, your knives, you name it. They'd have these huge punch-ups up and down the main street and going into shopping centres and all around. They'd be chasing each other and pickaxe handles, the whole 9 yards. So now any other political party that tried to have a meeting, the communists would disrupt those almost with impunity, but they couldn't disrupt the Nazi meetings. And this is something to keep in mind, that the idea there were these Nazi goons running around, or everyone else was sweet and pure as the driven. So no. The communists and the socialists all had their goon squads, all intimidating public officials, beating up judges, beating up town councillors, slapping around politicians and regional politicians and so on. That was all going on, and the people were looking at this, the citizenry were looking at this, horrified by what was happening. And a politician like Hitler was coming along and said, well, we won't let that happen, and we'll stop all that nonsense. And so that went down well with the voting public, as you can imagine. Also during this time, this is after World War I, there was a huge displacement of peoples, borders being redrawn, all sorts of things like that. And there were, again, a lot of Jewish people were being displaced out of all sorts of regions of Europe. So there was a lot of transit and movement of Jewish people. This too went down badly. But we should, we need to quantify the so-called Jewish issue in Germany. There were slightly less than 400,000 Jewish people in Germany and Austria at the time, and the population was over 80 million. So we're talking about just less than half of 1% of the population was Jewish. So we need to keep that in perspective. They were not a large part of the German or wider German diaspora. So this idea that Hitler had some sort of magic hypnotic effect, he was a firebrand orator, I don't buy that. I don't see any evidence of that at all. Now in the early 1920s, there was hyperinflation and rampant unemployment. Again, the political unrest I mentioned, the riots and the communist goon squads, their uprisings all over. So this was a time of great uncertainty and fear. a very stable German middle class that had existed in 1913 was now under terrible threat from all sides. Again, the hyperinflation, the unemployment, and so on. And during this time, with a new government trying to establish its get its feet under the table, you can see how this uncertainty would have led to a party like the Nazis or the socialists and the communists that were also saying we'll fix this. They did relatively well in the elections. Now in 1923, Hitler made a rather unwise and with hindsight, probably not well thought through attempt to launch in effect a coup in the state of Bavaria, not German federally, but the state of Bavaria, and it didn't go so well, and he ended up being arrested and thrown in prison. And it was during this time he dictated that book Mein Kampf. Now, sections of Mein Kampf have been misquoted and taken out of context, and Hitler talked about evicting the Jews from Germany, particularly given in light of their involvement with the revolutions and so on, or attempts at revolution in Germany and their agitation for a Marxist socialist state, this sort of thing. So it's because of that Hitler said, well, these guys aren't really, it's not really working out so well. He wanted to evict them. This is rewritten as he wanted to mass murder them. Now, that isn't what was happening back at the time. Later on became so, but not back then. The book of Mein Kampf, it's hardly a literary masterpiece, but it sold very well, actually, for a first-time author, somewhere around 250,000 copies. And so... I don't know what sort of royalties arrangement Hitler had, but you think he would have done rather well out of that. But it was, as books go, it was quite well received by the reading public. Now, around 1925, the rampant inflation was brought under control. American loans were starting to reinflate the economy or get it moving again. Unemployment came down quite substantially. The uprisings started to also dissipate. The firebrand rhetoric of the communists and the socialists was also dissipating. Now, a number of political parties, the communists, various communist people and socialist sort of agitators were banned from public speaking. And Hitler too was banned from public speaking, I think in Bavaria, for somewhere around 2 years. So they moved to become more federal around Germany at that point. So now when the Great Depression hit in October 1929, the economy of Germany suffered quite heavily, probably more so than a lot of other places actually. And so again the discontent of the masses and the inability of the German government at the time to address the issue. We need to understand the German government was still the plaything of aristocrats. And had Hitler been a colonel or something, he probably would have had a position in government. But given he was a corporal and an Austrian, then he and a working class guy, effectively, or you could say he was the bottom end of the middle class, I guess. But because of that, he wasn't treated seriously and was seen as an uncouth ruffian who should be not be considered for any serious position or office. So this is something that needs to be factored into understanding sort of where Hitler's at. He wasn't on the radar. Politics was a game for aristocrats and important people, army generals or army colonels, not for corporals. And the only thing that stopped Hitler from being dismissed out of hand was the fact he won the Iron Cross for bravery. And the army people who were, including Hindenburg and people like that, who were very much playing a part in the government, they couldn't ignore that Iron Cross thing. It was still a mark of something serious. Now, once the Depression set in, then again the socialist and the communist goon squads started to run around, again intimidating government officials and so on. The government appeared to have no real answer to it. Maybe in Berlin they put up a bit of a fight against the communists, but really not outside of that. And so, again, it was the Nazi goon squads that were the only people prepared to stop the communist goon squads. And the Nazis weren't intimidating the local populace, and the communists were. So this was something also to be taken into account. Now, I think that gives you a sort of an impression as to the times and what were going on, and I don't see during that time, I don't see straight anti-Semitism. I hate you because you're Jewish. I don't see that anywhere here. Not that there weren't people who weren't that way. There must have been. I mean, you look at that many millions of people. I'm sure you can find them. But the issue about the Marxist revolutions, the gay lesbian propaganda, all this sort of stuff being heavily overrepresented by Jewish people. This is really what I think was the issue, not the anti-Semitism. But let me know your thoughts. It is a controversial subject. This, of course, is only my opinion, and I'd be interested in seeing what you have to say below. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.